Brian, you'll be able to, I can give you the link, you can download it, whatever, and use it however you want.
I wouldn't know how to do that. I'll probably give it to somebody to do.
Okay, so here we are. It is the 16th of February, and
Of 2023.
Of 2023, indeed.
So to speak.
And we are here with Brian George, who just left.
Right here.
And to talk about basically anything and everything. I think this is going to be kind of freewheeling. I've got some questions. I kind of want to start off with a little biography, a little, getting to know who you are, because most people here don't. I know some of you have read some of the selections we sent out of your writing, and so we can use those as a jumping off point. I've also mentioned to the folks here at McGowan House that you seem to have many similar interests to us, including not just Carl Jung, but alchemy, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, art. So we've got a lot of, I think, overlapping interests. And anyhow, so Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, and I'm going to ask for a particular slant towards how the you don't call it the unconscious, you call it something else, intruded upon your life from a very early age.
Well, I think, when I was younger, probably I would have thought in terms of the unconscious, but that's really more of an intellectual concept, and my own encounters, let's say, with some other larger part of the self or deeper part of the self, however you'd want to define that, or expansive part of the self, didn't really define themselves in terms of conscious and unconscious. It was more in terms of personal as opposed to, I don't know, other than personal or more than personal parts of the self. And for a long time, my creative process was very unpredictable, mixed in with visionary pursuits. Probably starting from the age of 16, I had a very sudden sense of being projected into something fairly violently, into some almost inconceivable depth. So between the ages of 15 and 16, I felt that I had gone from childhood to something much more ancient, something not really very personal. And I would look around, and this, some of the things that I look back on now seem psychotic to me at the time. In fact, it was really just kind of a language that I was learning how to speak. So I was so preoccupied with depth that even just normal landscapes, I remember often looking out of my window at night, and I lived in Worcester, Massachusetts, which was, I lived in a factory area. It used to be the industrial heart of New England before all of the factories left. And I remember looking out, and everything would seem two-dimensional. I had almost a literal sense of buildings being made out of cardboard, of there being nothing at all behind them, just some sort of a yawning void or a heaving ocean or depth of unimaginable darkness. And it seemed like everything was about to be washed away or sometimes blown away. Luckily, there was a kind of inner guidance that also began to take over at the time, but in a way that seemed more threatening than consoling. So that I began having dreams in which I would experience some sort of a presence, sometimes a visible presence, sometimes not a visible presence, but a presence that would, kind of yank me into situations that were at first somewhat terrifying. Plummeting out of the sky and crashing, being crucified, But probably most significantly in terms of something that people might have read, there was the first in a series of dreams that happened, I think when I was 18 or 19, where a guide actually took me down through a series of levels of collapsing civilizations. In retrospect, after however you pronounce it, Derinkuyu, it's a city of 18 levels in Cappadocia. But I realized looking back that this was sort of the site of the dream. But each level was a civilization that I was led through, and we'd wander and observe various, rites and centers and areas of the culture, and then something would happen, either be destroyed by fire, flood, comets, whatever it happened to be. And we would just barely escape and keep going down and down into various levels, sometimes plunging into a well, going through a crack in the wall, going down a staircase, but always continuing to go down. But the very odd thing about the dream was that it wasn't quite a dream. I was aware that I was dreaming, and I kept waking up perhaps once an hour for maybe 5 hours. And that completely reoriented my sense of time, and created also was part of a series of dreams that created a split between what I felt that I could encompass in any way intellectually or on a personal level, and something else that was waiting to be explored, acknowledged. It was like a gulf had opened between my immediate perception of the self and then something else that was making almost nonsensical demands, and also calling forth some degree of creativity that I didn't begin to possess.
So you had your own Christmas Carol experience.
Pretty much, yeah. For a long time, dreams were one of the major ways that aspect of the self communicated. There were other instances, though. An instance a little bit later where often things would happen fairly late at night, because I used to stay up very late writing, even when I had school the next day. There was another incident that happened, I think I was about 19 or 20, where I wasn't asleep at all. I was lying in my bed writing, and there was an incredible kind of a ringing and droning sound. I thought at first it was almost like an alarm for like a nuclear alert. It just seemed overwhelmingly loud, something designed to be heard by everybody in Worcester to get them out of bed to, I didn't really know what. There were no particular procedures to follow, but I remember running around my house, looking out of the windows, and nobody else seemed to hear it. My family didn't get up. There was nobody on the street. And then I became aware that it was actually more like a kind of music. This is before I had heard Tibetan chanting, but the sensation was very similar. Incredibly low bass notes, and then almost, ringing high notes going into inaudible overtones. And the next morning I woke up and nobody clearly had heard a thing. And again, I became very much aware of this split in my being between things that I was meant to see, experience, hear, and whatever the common perception of reality might be.
Did you ever have a sense that you were crazy?
Oh yeah. No, that was the period I'm talking about. I often was terrified of going to sleep because I didn't know if I would be sane when I woke up, or if I would remember who I was. I used to be a devoted bike rider too. I needed like physical activity to kind of balance out the kind of inner intensity or sometimes chaos. And I remember going to the top of Airport Hill in Worcester once, which is a very long and difficult climb. And at the top, there was a sensation of everything being just about to disintegrate into light. And I had just discovered Jackson Pollock, and I remembered thinking, no, I don't want to turn into a Jackson Pollock painting. Yeah, Yeah, I was like literally terrified that I wouldn't be able to recognize common objects anymore, that I wouldn't remember my name. It was a sense of just being completely overwhelmed by kind of an ocean of light.
Given that experience and what you've said so far, it seems like, and some of the things I've read of yours, that you must have had a pretty strong identification with Jung's The Red Book when it was published, and his, you know, in some ways parallel over different chunks of time, but, you know, his fear of psychosis and his discovery of vast dimensions of time and space and mythology and the unknown, and his 2 million year old self that he was, you know, it took him, what, 20 years to begin to come to terms with some of that imagery and sensation. And what he was saying was that he had lost his soul, and this was part of finding himself, this whole experience of psychosis becoming enlightenment almost. Did that ring similar?
Actually, that's the one book of Jung's I haven't read. I went through a very intensive period of reading Jung from actually about the age that I was talking about up through my late 30s. But I actually just recently bought a copy of the Red Book because Lisa had mentioned it. I'm very familiar with what people have said about it, and his memories, dreams, and reflections kind of touches on some of those experiences from more of a distance. But I remember reading that book and identifying very closely with some of the experiences he was talking about. But yeah, the sense of, I don't know, enlightenment being something very dangerous is something that really struck me reading Jung. I mean, obviously he has a very cool scientific front that he was trying to present, but if you're in tune with him, you can really sense, you know, just the incredible personal experience behind it. I mean, almost to the extent that the scientific theories were erected as a kind of a mask to, you know, create a public face for something that could never be communicated otherwise.
Exactly. Yeah. I would love to have you come back after you read the Red Book.
I plan to do that sometime in the near future. Just, got a very nice, luckily not terribly expensive copy that has a fake leather cover.
I hope it's the one with the images in it too.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, he had a feeling of going crazy while the unconscious was erupting in his life, you know, in much the same way. And he would argue with it, and he would write down these arguments between these figures in his head and himself. And anyhow, I won't go off on too much of a tangent, but yeah, we read it as a group here a few years ago. And I think it was helpful for me anyway to read it as a group. I don't think I would have been able to get through it if I had to read it on my own.
I'm curious if you found a lot of your experiences of other times and dimensions to sometimes be sort of precognitional, so that I mean, I'll just say that at age 63, I took a deep dive into deep time, and I haven't returned, and I don't plan on returning. So that things that, you know, happened 7,500 years ago seemed like yesterday.
Oh,
and
yeah,
I don't know how to talk about it, really. It's just what is. And so I wonder, I mean, Jung, to bring the Red Book, he had all these visions before his psychotic enlightenment break of rivers running with blood. And then at the beginning of World War I, he realized that, you know, that there were rivers running with blood, and that he had, you know, his altered state had anticipated that. Did any of your deep dives have that kind of repercussion?
In terms of anything that happened, you know, like in a linear fashion, before 9/11, I went through actually a series of very intense, visionary experiences after receiving Shaktipada yogic initiation in 1990, which released a flood of both creativity and kind of a return to what I earlier had perceived as, possible psychosis, but this was in a much more controlled fashion and in conjunction with spiritual discipline. So it wasn't really in any way frightening the second time around. But a number of references to the destruction of the World Trade Towers came up.
Huh.
The World Trade Towers, for a fourth time fall, their shadows stand, was one of the lines.
Huh.
So written around 1990.
Wow.
So while I was reading some of your, or I should say rereading some of your stuff today, in preparation for this, the word that just jumped into my head was prophet. Like some of the stuff you write about just seemed prophetic. We don't really speak about prophets in our modern times. They seem to be a relic of biblical times. Well, actually, I think maybe some religions have their modern day prophets, but I don't know if I want to ask you a question about that. It seems.
Oh, you can ask, but yeah, sure.
Well, I mean, to ask if you've felt that way, is one thing, but I don't want to put you on the spot, because to associate oneself with being a prophet carries a lot of weight. So I don't necessarily want to put that on you, but just have you ever, like had that kind of, oh my God, is this happening kind of response?
Yeah, first let me say that I kind of came of age spiritually in terms of actual spiritual discipline, as opposed to my own self-created guidance or other dimensional guidance or whatever. In the 80s, I became very much aware of my need to study with meditation teachers and to study yoga, and I had reached the limits of my knowledge. And I remember thinking at the time there was a lot of kind of new age self-advertisement and all sorts of people claiming to be channelers or prophets or whatever, however they would define that. When we used to have physical, like alternative newspapers, you could go to the back and there'd be people listing their gifts as healers, and there'd be all kinds of, elaborate titles they would give themselves. And it would be like people listing, prizes and university degrees and places they've exhibited if they were an artist or whatever, places to publish that they were a poet. There was an incredible amount of self-promotion or kind of almost, charmingly naive arrogance involved in the way people would present themselves and their, spiritual credentials. So that's something that I always wanted to avoid. But at the same time, my sense of what my calling was, or what I was meant to do as a writer and an artist, is very much in that direction. So to some extent, it's one reason that I tend to sometimes present myself almost in the third person. For example, I wrote, I guess you would call it like a visionary epic. Started back in 1991 after that yogic initiation, and only finished last year. But it was kind of prompted by Sumerian poem, very ancient, which I can no longer find anywhere. It just kind of came and went. The Lament for the Courier. So I present myself as being a courier in this poem. So I speak of myself in the third person rather than the first. I also use various devices, like I have a book Mass of the Metaphysical Double and the Footprints of de Chirico, in which I'm speaking in the persona of Giorgio de Chirico, the kind of proto-surrealist painter, who was an incredible megalomaniac. But, you know, to some extent, I sort of like formalize certain prophetic instincts or visionary instincts. Other times I do speak much more directly, but my sense is it's either there in the work or it's not. And that's one reason I haven't really published to any extent when I was younger. I began publishing online in 2007. I used to publish quite a bit in Reality Sandwich back when that was, before it became corporatized. There were a lot of good people writing for it, and gave me a chance to really also engage with an audience rather than just sort of making any spiritual claims or whatever, or presenting something in, when I met my wife in '94, she used to claim that I was writing almost incomprehensible hieroglyphs. So actually being able to interact with an audience, this is back when people actually used to comment, you know, some length or, you know, in quantity on complex literary essays. I'm not getting that kind of response too often anymore. The internet seems to have become heavily politicized, and even when you find sites where people are posting a lot, it's usually because a writer is famous, and then everybody sort of idolizes the writer and all of the comments agree with each other. This was actually something where people would kind of challenge me and test me in certain ways, and I would respond to all of the comments. But it made me very painfully aware both of the limitations in my prose style and my ability really to communicate my vision in any meaningful way. So I took that. I tend to respond to things often as ultimatums, like the early experience with, however you would define it, inner guidance, other dimensional guidance, really came to me in the form of a series of ultimatums. But I felt that way also when I began to really expose my work to critique. I had done it when I was much younger, when I moved to Boston from Worcester, and I was part of a circle of writers that pretty much stayed in touch from like '74 to the mid '80s. So everybody, you know, critiqued each other's work and provided a lot of creative prompts and, you know, sometimes antagonistic, mostly good-natured feedback. So that was one kind of a challenge, but I outgrew that and the group sort of drifted apart. But this was an attempt to present something that really existed only on an intuitive level when I began publishing online. And I realized that there was not only a gulf between my personal self and the larger aspect of the self that I've been exploring for quite a while, but there was a gulf between my ability to express or convey that vision and people's capacity to understand anything I was saying. So I published about 24 essays in Reality Sandwich, which were an invaluable training exercise. Then that sort of led up to around 2012, 13. And that was maybe the very early stages of my kind of mature style as a writer. But I feel like it's really only over I just turned 67 this year, a few months ago. And I feel like it's only over the past 3 or 4 years that I've fully come into my own in terms of an ability to really embody the energy and the vision that I've been, however you put it, pursuing or attempting to translate since I was very young. Just give me a second, I'll be right back.
So if anybody else has anything they want to jump in with, I don't intend to be the only interlocutor here or questioner.
Actually, I did have a few. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
It's Eileen. Do you mean me? I was going to ask the relationship of your early visions as a teenager. how does it correlate, or does it, to the situation you are now? Is it a wider view, or is it just a different way of looking at things at age 67, where you've reached a point of knowing something?
Well, I had actually wanted to read something that ties in with what we were talking about earlier, but I'll get to that in a minute. It's a very curious thing. As I've gotten older, things that I experience really as just being like puzzle pieces, or, kind of parts of a fractured mirror or something, just from kind of momentary angles, have over time really assembled themselves into not really like any kind of a, really has nothing to do with theory or with like even a coherent philosophy necessarily, but the vision has become, much more unified. But the odd thing is those early experiences are tied in a very peculiar way with what I'm seeing and doing now. One thing that came back to me kind of strongly over the spring, actually, I was working on revising a book that I put out for friends in '84 that I never thought could be revised, but I was thrown back to a number of earlier experiences, and I had vivid memories of when I was first starting to write when I was 16, of hearing a voice in my head, which was not the voice of any the other dimensional guide, which was sometimes present either as a voice or in dreams. This was something else altogether. It was actually a sense of listening to myself in the future. I didn't even necessarily know that that's what it was at the time, but I could hear a voice sort of speaking in a particular rhythm. I could, kind of glimpse certain images. I could grasp certain themes. The feeling tone of it was something that seemed extremely familiar to me in some way. But it was something that I just sort of imagined like in a fantasy level of being able to do at some point. But then once I was actually able to write the way I wanted over the past, say, 10 years or so, I realized that I was sort of acting out that voice that had been somehow very audibly, tangibly present from a very early age, not in a way that I could really even hear the words, but I could hear what was behind the words. I could hear the rhythm of the words. It was sort of like listening to almost a good poet recite a poem in a different language.
Yeah.
So you sort of get a strong sense of who that poet is or the feeling tone or whatever, but you can't specifically grasp what's going on. This was even more specific than that, but yeah, there's a line in one of my essays: the shortest distance between 2 points may turn out to be a labyrinth. And that's been very much true for me, that I've never been able to go in a straight line towards anything I wanted to do. And it's only really in retrospect that I've been able to get like an overview of how things fit together. But I wish I had sort of reached this point when I was maybe 35. I feel like I need another 20, 30 years to be able to, I don't know, just sort of, chuckle softly to myself about being able to write this way, or being able to experience, the vision that I've been pursuing in a way that's, joyful or even ecstatic rather than threatening. Because at the earlier stages, often presented themselves as both an ultimatum and a threat, is just something that, the vision or the guidance I was being provided came in the form of a demand. The sense of, there's that line from Rilke about the archaic torso of Apollo that's looking back at him, and it says, you must change your life. So rather than necessarily feeling comforted or supported by spiritual guidance, I felt really that I was under a kind of commandment to take myself apart and put myself back together in a fashion that would be more acceptable to this larger aspect. And even now, there's a certain tension between where I am at any particular moment and whatever this larger aspect is. So creatively, I often feel that the two are very close to merging, or even one part is sort of changing places with the other. But there's always a fundamental tension and duality.
I was thinking at some points in your life, it was more of a curse. And later in life, it seems as though it's a gift that you have. Things not being as clear, but it seems like you have a gift, and it was hard in the beginning, but not all hard. And now
Well, I think
go
one
ahead.
hard part was, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I'd finished.
I think the hard part, probably in terms of young too, is just not having very much to fall back on. When I began to come of age in Worcester when I was a teenager, this was like in the late 60s, early 70s. And even at the time when I was in high school, I knew people that had taken way too many LSD trips or whatever. And there was a sense of both that, kind of dramatic temptation of spiritual expansion, or just, kind of recklessly throwing yourself into the beyond. But a lot of people really were not in any way up to doing that, or totally lacked the preparation or knowledge or setting that would really allow any kind of entheogens to be safe and effective. So I was very much aware of the risk of, say, spiritual expansion, or particularly as related to peyote, LSD, mescaline, or whatever, which I tried for about a year. But what people fell back on at that point were religious cults. There were like a lot of Jesus freaks in Worcester at the time. There were all kinds of little spiritual groups. I was almost kidnapped by the Moonies at one point. I'd run into German architectural student in the Worcester Library, and we got into a great conversation. He was very bright, and he invited me to dinner with friends that night. And they picked me up at my house and took me to a place like way on the outskirts of Worcester, like 10 miles from my house. So it'd be very difficult to walk back. And I realized I'd been invited to dinner with the Moonies. And it began pleasantly enough. I didn't quite realize what I had gotten myself into, but everybody had these fixed smiles on their faces and this, these glassy stares in their eyes. And they just kept repeating the same few cliches and talking points, and referring to me as an average Joe, and telling me that I really needed to listen to my spiritual betters. And I realized what a mess I was. And I was reading a lot of Nietzsche at the time, and became extremely arrogant and argumentative and loud. And I'd kind of wear one person down, and he would say, "Oh, well, you really need to talk to Raphael over here," and Raphael would get fed up with me and say, "Oh, you really need to talk to Klaus." And I would talk to Klaus. And finally, like 2 a.m, they'd all become utterly fed up with me and decided that they would take me home, which I'd asked them to do like 4 hours earlier. But, so I really didn't have any sense that there was much in the way of external support. I did have a speech teacher senior year in high school, Sue Castigliano, who was kind of a de facto spiritual guide and psychological counselor. I don't think I would be here without her. But that was pure luck or whatever, that relationship. And I didn't really either trust any teachers I might encounter, or trust myself to know who or what I was looking at, even if I were inclined in that direction. So the sense that I had to do everything myself, or, trust to some extent, whatever intelligence I had or knowledge I could acquire. And beyond that, whatever intuitive or other dimensional guidance I was being given, was somewhat of a frightening thought. I mean, aside from just the kind of the terror of some of the spaces that opened up, just the feeling that there was like no safety net, really nothing and no one to fall back on.
It seemed like between high school and the time you went to art school, there was an intense period of self-education in what was it, the Clark University Library?
Yeah, I was back at a time when Worcester had, colleges weren't hermetically sealed. I don't know why. They seem to have become that way. But yeah, I worked, actually I'm using this in an essay that I'm still in the process of writing, but yeah, I worked 8 hours a day at the Worcester Telegram and Gazette as a janitor. And I mostly just remember just the incredible amounts of ink over every surface. And it was like painting the Brooklyn Bridge or whatever. As soon as you got done, you had to start again. Then I was also working as a volunteer counselor at the Worcester Crisis Center, which was a drug abuse and suicide prevention hotline. So that was something. It was also kind of a way of healing myself as well, partly to get beyond any adolescent narcissism. I don't think I was unusually narcissistic, but I was aware of, being focused on my own needs. So it kind of yanked me out of myself in a way that was, kind of oddly comforting and healing. I realized that however messed up I wasn't nearly as messed up as many people. But then I would spend almost all of my free time reading. I'd grown up in a working class neighborhood where school was very much one size fits all. I had virtually no good teachers that I can think of up until my junior year of high school. I had gotten kicked out of parochial school. I'd gone there for 2 years due to
Congratulations, by the way. having suffered parochial school, I would have loved it.
Well, I'd gone there just to get out of my immediate neighborhood, but it was like, going from the frying pan into the fire or whatever. I didn't make a single friend when I was there. It made me realize how truly odd I was. The school really, it was like the only place I've gone that resembled the like Hollywood movies about high schools with, football players and cheerleaders. The pep rallies where, the priest would be invoking God before the big game. Anyway, there was a nationwide protest against Nixon's bombing of Cambodia, and I was very politically oriented from an early age. And it seemed like probably 2/3 of the school was originally going to take part. There were events all around Worcester at the time, and the headmaster came out and made a series of threats. And first, small groups would head back in, but then by the hundreds, almost everybody went back inside. I think about 12 of us were left. And most of them weren't even political. They just wanted the day off. Like some of them went off to play pool. Another one went off to work on his car. A couple of others went to, this is a weird period where sex was associated with the revolution. So a couple of other people went off to like a Marxist pornographic bookstore. And I think 3 of us went to Holy Cross College for a teach-in. So the headmaster had just said, absence will be treated as such, which I thought meant, oh, great, I'll just be marked absent for the day, whatever. It was a deliberately ambiguous statement. And I found out later that we could either agree to issue a formal apology in front of the school, and it would also be posted by the headmaster's office, and agree to a new set of rules that would apply only to us, or we could leave. And I took it as kind of a wake-up call. I'd been, aside from the debating club, I'd been totally miserable during my 2 years there, and finally managed to go to an excellent school in the affluent part of Worcester, where I had my first encounter with actual teachers. Curiously, my family never realized that I had been kicked out. I was so secretive as a teenager that they didn't ask and I didn't tell.
Well, we've had a number of conversations with various people about the 60s, particularly in Berkeley. And so it's interesting to hear you talk about the 60s and 70s on the other side of the country, which I don't know. It's I don't know if it was similar or different. You have some really interesting lines in, which one is this?
Black Gold piece.
Yeah, about a lot of countercultural energy had already turned dark by the beginning of the decade. We had stamped our collective foot against the shadow of the empire, and still that shadow grew. We could not stop Agent Orange from destroying 18,000 square miles of forest. We could not prevent dioxin from disfiguring the limbs of the not yet born. We could not stop napalm from burning at 2,200 degrees or Dow Chemical from making billions. And then later, you said, there was in fact no shelter to be had. There was no deferment for the bourgeois psyche, no evolutionary safe room at Big Sur. So here we are in Monterey, just 45 minutes north of Big Sur. And I've been thinking all day about, well, an evolutionary safe room at Big Sur. There's still a lot of people down there who would think they're in an evolutionary safe room. But are the trees, the redwoods, they, to me, feel like an evolutionary safe room. I'm just curious what some of the rest of these California folks here who have communed in Big Sur would have to say about that. Have you been to Big Sur? Did this come from personal experience, Brian?
Oh no, I really haven't had the money to travel. I would love to go to Big Sur. Nothing personal about that, by the way.
Oh, I know.
No, I did feel like that's referring to a very early period, but I do feel that in the same way that, like if you look at the 19th century, there was a lot of actual revolutionary activity leading up to the revolutions of 1848. Then a lot of the energy that went into, the goals around that year, because there was, government crackdowns and, just defeat of the various revolutionary forces, a lot of that energy was poured into the arts. And I feel the same way about like the kind of literal revolutionary energy of the 60s being kind of transferred over to, let's say, spiritual transformation in the decades that followed, in a way that, it was certainly valid, but it also was to some extent, among the only places the energy could go, but also it was sort of a deflection of the original desire for transformation.
Yeah, and there seems to be kind of this still the same trajectory. You talked about the corporatization. And, I couldn't help, too bad Robin's not here, because I couldn't help but think about Burning Man, and how—
It's a perfect example, which I have many friends who have gone, and the idea of it seemed very appealing to me at first, particularly when I was publishing back in Reality Sandwich, as I mentioned. A lot of people connected with writers and readers were people who went to Burning Man like every year. And I think the original event or idea, whatever, was certainly a valid one, but it's become almost a playground for high-tech billionaires now, or people who are involved in kind of the glamour of the lifestyle, but that particular type of spirituality, or kind of the mask of mask of shamanism, or desire to return to some primordial form of consciousness. As valid
Right,
as
and even, I mean, Burning Man started out as a gift economy. When I see you, Eileen. It started out as a gift economy, and then, you know, the corporate buses with the air conditioning started showing up. At least that's what Robin's told us. I personally haven't been. And like the whole money economy got polluted into the gift economy. I don't know.
I mean, I think that happened very much, you know, in the, from 67, let's say, if you look at the Jefferson airplane compared to Jefferson Starship in 74 or whatever, it's remarkable, really, how quickly virtually everything can be corporatized, no matter how explosive the original creative impulse. Kind of its kind of corporate imitation is just, I mean, there's almost a kind of genius to it, the way one thing can be replaced with another. Yeah,
we used the word back in the 60s of co-option. Everything was co-opted. Everything, every noble, political, spiritual, collective, artistic, creative, philosophical impulse that was really genuine and arising, you know, from a luminous ground was very soon co-opted. And, you know, the big co-option, as far as I can tell, was, you know, up until the second wave of feminism in the 60s, we, men and women, worked together really well. There wasn't any awareness of differences in race or economic class or gender. None of that stuff mattered, right? We were on a wave of transformation, as you said, and it was beautiful. But all of a sudden, the co-opting powers were looking for spokespeople, right? To say what, report on what was going on with the Black Panthers, or, you know, it's on Sproul Plaza. I was in Berkeley and at San Francisco State during the San Francisco State strike, and the men suddenly relegated the women to running the copy machines and answering the phone, and stepped out. You know, they had the voice of authority and greater intelligence and stuff, which was the beginning, quite literally, of second wave feminism. Yeah, I think
there's maybe two things going on there. I remember some very arrogant Marxist group leaders who were filling, you know, kind of classic paternal roles, even though they were talking about, you know, various types of liberation. So people's kind of childhood tendencies, or, you know, kind of the baggage of history is still with people, no matter what their conscious ideas or desire to do things in a different way. They're, you know, going to act out of whatever they are. And often there'll be, it's not even hypocrisy, because hypocrisy takes a certain amount of self-awareness. It's like, I don't know, evangelical ministers who are caught with prostitutes. You think, oh, what a hypocrite. But it's just that there's a split within their being.
right.
And they are probably sincere about their beliefs, but they've just sort of squashed other things completely down in a way that they, whatever they don't want to deal with, you know, just disappears until it comes back with a vengeance. But I think the same thing can be true of gender roles or materialism. I think, you know, the other thing that I remember kind of sadly is just how, did we lose contact?
No, we're still here.
Okay. I saw somebody's wall picture or something.
Yeah.
But it makes me kind of both nostalgic and sad to remember just how naive we were in certain ways, how unaware of our own potential for darkness, or how interconnected everything was, so that we thought really the kind of sincere desire for change was the same thing as the ability to bring it about in any meaningful way. That's another thing that the Black Gold essay is about.
Well, as you so eloquently point out, we had no education. I did not come across a real teacher in school until my senior year. That was the first time I encountered a teacher where I had a connection with. And my very first teacher was a pre-kindergarten teacher who was abusing kids, sexually abusing kids. So we really didn't have much to fall back on in terms of cultural support or understanding, or such a thing as compassion. It wasn't there. Almost immediately, people who wanted change and were thinking different, were kind of they were ready to institutionalize us for psychosis, and and ready to shoot us down in the streets. That happened quite a bit in Oakland, etc. There was just no potential in the society for dialogue or support.
Yeah. Hang on, Eileen, do you still want to say something? You had your hand up.
I did. This is off topic now, but I was wondering what motivates you to go around talking about this. I listened to a podcast of yours halfway through, right up to this presentation, and you talked about the same kind of things, and I'm wondering, does it get tedious, and why is it related to something that I haven't seen, which is the mountain experience? Are you wanting to let people know about your own gifts and understandings? Yes,
He
that
has
was
a book to sell.
no, that was what he was talking about. The mass of origin. It was part of the presentation of
And the podcast.
the evolution of himself was in the podcast. And so then I hear it again tonight, not fully in either case, but I'm wondering what the motivation is to go on and present your story.
Well, from what people have said about the interview with Layman Pascal, you probably stopped right at the point where it begins to get good. The beginning around an hour, I guess, people have mentioned that it really begins to pick up in both playfulness and intensity. That was only the second podcast I had done. The first one actually isn't up yet. It should be going up, I think, this week on Occult of Personality. So I'm actually just like a toddler when it comes to even beginning to talk about my work. Often, let's say, I'll casually mention that I'm a writer if I'm in an Uber, and the driver will ask, "Oh, what is your book about?" And I generally have, no answer. I'll say, "Oh, it's complicated."
It is.
So I'm really just beginning to be able to summarize or paraphrase some of the themes. I feel absolute confidence as a writer to be able to express, even very complicated ideas or labyrinthine narratives, or navigate between esoteric references or difficult images or whatever. But I'm somewhat of a Luddite, and I really have avoided any kind of podcasts up until now, partly due to nervousness or whatever, partly just because I didn't think that I would be able to articulately summarize my work. But with the publication of the book, I felt, well, really time to get over that. My wife and I host, or up until the pandemic, hosted bi-monthly salons where we would have artists, writers, musicians, groups, storytellers, whatever, together for often about 6 hours on a Friday night, with people taking turns presenting and commenting on each other's work. In that kind of a situation, I feel completely relaxed and confident about talking and have no reservations about presenting a piece that I've been working on and explaining what I'm doing. But the podcast format is a new one to me, and just speaking to people I don't know or to the public at large seemed like a very intimidating thing to me, but actually talking to you and to the people that I've talked to before on those other 2 podcasts I mentioned, I realize it's not any different from just talking to a friend. So it's kind of a relief, and I'm hoping to get better at it. But it's proving to be much more fun than I expected.
But you want people to know about your work, so you feel that you have something valuable to transmit, obviously, to go through this.
I guess, yeah, my hesitation really had to do with the fact that I've spent a very long time in being able to finally be able to say what I want to say as both a poet and an essay writer. And I didn't know if there was any way to kind of approximate the same breadth of vision or depth of intuition or whatever that I can pretty easily at this point communicate as a writer in conversation. So I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
I see.
I also, in terms of returning to the earlier question about prophetic vision or whatever, I do feel, I guess, an obligation to finally begin to communicate on a much broader level in terms of spiritual vision, or however you would want to define that. I don't necessarily want to prove anything, convince anybody of anything, but I do want to make my own experience available. So it's more a question of kind of opening myself up for dialogue, just, kind of letting people know, I've been here, I saw that, whatever. So the problem with prophets in general, I mean, in past century or whatever, is that they're way too concerned with their self-image. I'm much more concerned with really transmitting my vision itself. And, I have no concern about, kind of polishing my brand or presenting myself in that direction. Actually, that brings us to a short piece I was thinking of reading today.
Can we see what Andrea's had her hand up? Can we just
sure.
see what she wants to say before we get to the short piece?
Of course.
Yeah. Hi, Brian.
Hi.
So here I am. I'm reading your book, and our minds are very different, even though I have depth and breadth, but I feel like my mind is rather focused and linear. That's where it is comfortable. And so reading your book has not been comfortable, but I can't stop. And there are certain things that I find absolutely so amusing and enjoyable, like your rant on narcissism. It's just marvelous. I loved it. But the most intriguing thing is the Minotaur. And it's like over the course of your labyrinthine writing, as you just mentioned, which is very appropriate for the Minotaur, it's like there is a depth of insight that I feel kind of is creeping into me through the many ways that you meander about. It's very interesting. It's very intriguing to me. So I am enjoying reading it, and I will continue to read. I'm pleased to be here with you.
Oh, thank you. That is very much the intent of the way I write, is to, I mean, it's a very kind of sneaky way of writing.
Yeah.
That I'm not really trying to communicate in terms of conveying an idea, proving a thesis, even telling a story. And I guess maybe in a simple way, I'm trying to take the reader by surprise.
You are.
And to create, again, using the word unconscious, more of an unconscious engagement
Mhm.
in a way that the reader doesn't necessarily know what's happening until they find themselves in the
Until
middle.
it hits. It's working. It's working. I'm very much enjoying it. I love being made aware of the monster in the depth in myself. You know, it's a very necessary work to do. So I really appreciate your tickling my subconscious.
That was you're talking about My Friend the Minotaur. That was a very tricky piece to write that, I mean, I revised virtually everything several dozen times, but that one was about a very close friend who I met junior year in high school. He was sitting next to me in art class, and we became, very close friends for decades afterwards. And we would, sometimes not see each other for a few years. He was going to a school out of state. And when I was engaged to my first wife, we were driving along a highway in Rhode Island with her housemate. And the person that it's about, Danny, I changed his last name, was standing by the side of the road hitchhiking, completely dressed in black leather with like a 4-day beard stubble and skeleton earrings, looking, I don't know, kind of like a Hell's Angel or something. And my ex-wife's roommate said, "Oh, look at that freak by the road. He thinks somebody's actually going to pick him up." And I said, "Oh, that's one of my best friends from high school." Anyway, so that was one reunion, and we lived together for a couple of years. But it was an odd situation where we just kind of slowly grew apart. It's natural enough for teenagers to be arrogant and somewhat narcissistic. And, I guess, there was some aspect of that in me as well. We also just had a lot of fun. We told jokes. We, in high school, made fun of people. And he was a brilliant, challenging guy. But at some point, particularly after I began to focus on spiritual discipline during the 1980s, I just realized that we were living in completely separate worlds. And I think 1991 was the last time we actually met. And I called him in 2001, and it was like talking to a complete stranger. So I wanted to really explore the relationship and kind of the spiritual aspect or metaphysical aspect of narcissism. So in that piece, I was jumping between actual memories of my friend, not in a way, I wasn't in any way angry with him. I was just aware of like having moved into a totally different space. But I realized that too, kind of probing the relationship was giving me insights into something much older and deeper in terms of the culture at large. So I jumped between, very personal memories and the idea of the Minotaur. So things that would seem to be just kind of a grandiose elaboration of a personal relationship, but that's not really what I was trying to do, which is one reason why it demanded so many revisions. That bringing those two things together while maintaining the tension, not just sort of like over dramatizing a relationship that kind of faded out or went bad or whatever, but kind of exploring the actual mythological context of narcissism in a way that connects with capitalism and the current state of the West or whatever. Also, media trends. Was a very challenging thing to do. I think I finally pulled it off, but writing it was kind of like a high wire juggling act. And my wife kept saying, don't even think about using his name. It's way too personal. But that just kept prompting me to revise it until I reached the point where I felt that it was sufficiently dispassionate, where it didn't seem like I was trying to get even for something, that
No.
I was actually kind of moving fluidly back and forth between kind of smaller and larger
Yeah.
levels of signification.
Yeah, that is so fascinating in your book, is that weaving through the different levels of consciousness, the personal experience, the metaphysical experience, the archetypal world. It's fascinating. It works. It's like you're in a labyrinth and you keep you keep following this. Yeah.
No, your comments are right on the mark. Yeah. People who don't get it, just sort of take the style as being, I guess, annoying or difficult. To some extent, you have to give yourself to it at least a little bit to be able to work it all. And
Yeah.
I find that people often do go through very, very distinct stages that I've come to recognize over time. There are people who just don't get it, don't want to get it, don't care. Why are you writing in a way that doesn't get to the point? Or, you keep taking these, kind of weird, unpredictable turns and, throwing in these little koans for no reason or images that really don't necessarily explain anything, that just create little
They all weave together.
obstacles or whatever.
They all weave together,
But I mean, that is the point of it, is to kind of slow people down. That's the way I learned to read when I finally began to read seriously on my own, starting probably like as an earlier teenager, but much more seriously when I finally went to a good school and had teachers that challenged me. But we went from reading Joyce Kilmer's Trees sophomore year. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree, something like that. And the first thing we studied in junior year was Eliot's The Wasteland. And I remember it was just like being dumped into the middle of a large lake and being forced to swim, which actually that was the way my grandfather was taught to swim. His father came over from Ireland toward the end of the 19th century. And I do think it was an actual kind of ancient tradition, but they taught my grandfather to swim by rowing him into the middle of Lake Quinsigamond, dumping him in and then rowing back. And that was sort of what it was like to struggle with Eliot's The Wasteland, but I found it incredibly invigorating after education that was really just designed to produce people to work in the factories in my neighborhood, where you just had to like memorize things. And theoretically in parochial school, you studied Latin to teach you how to think or whatever, but you would be immediately punished if you tried any such thing.
Actually fought something original. Yeah. Been there, done that.
I guess what I would like to add is diving into your book is letting go of control. And I appreciate it.
But anyway, just to finish what I was saying, so my technique for learning anything was to just slow myself down, to read things out loud over and over, to kind of inhabit the voice of the writer, to kind of move with his voice rhythms, his physical rhythms, his psychic rhythms, to really kind of descend into what I didn't know until it began to speak to me. So that actually became my creative method as well. A lot of people write to tell you what they think or to express an idea. Even when I begin that way, which I sometimes do, I always end up working against myself. I don't want to just tell other people what I know. I want to discover what I know, then to use that as a starting place to go further.
Right. And let the reader discover with you. Yeah.
So
thank you.
Let me read something just responding to that idea of style. Various things I thought I might read. It's organized here. Yeah, this is a brief excerpt from a piece that went up in a magazine online magazine called Scene 4, International Magazine of Arts and Culture, last month. So this is just a little bit on the nature of style. Again, beginning with the dream, this is a continuation decades later of the dream that I described a little while back. In 1988, I had a dream in which a green figure took me by the hand. He led me layer by layer through an underground megalithic complex. We came to a door with a corbel arch and then entered a great hall, at whose center was a mass of writhing snakes, lashing this way and that, copulating and tying themselves into knots. Moving closer, it became apparent that the snakes were all made from rubber. Thinking, there is nothing to be scared of, I reached down to pick one up, and then immediately felt it sink its fangs into my hand. My guide said, "We always mix in a few real ones for effect." The pain in my hand was sharp. Even now I can feel the impact of its fangs. Like the rubber snake that bites, I would pierce the reader's psyche. My vision is meant to wound, not heal. Any healing may or may not happen later on. A cosmology is embedded in the crossweave of the text, in the toxin of the snake, in the body of the reader. A cosmology that even now exists in its first and final form. What heals and what harms are in no way antithetical. Good habits may in fact be symptoms. Hidden energies may disturb us. We have infinitely far to travel to reach the space in which we breathe.
Beautiful.
Did you want to say more, Sandra? You have your hand up.
Oh, that was really beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, unlike Andrea, I just haven't had time to listen to the whole interview. And looked at some of your articles in Dark Mountain, and I immediately loved what you were doing, because I also have crazy experiences of deep time and other places, and they're more, a lot of lucid dreaming. They're more concrete and real to me than, quote, normal reality, and so the challenge is always integration. And so people who are talking about the masks we wear, who are talking about the different times we actually inhabit, right, are, I want to sit down and have tea and talk for weeks, because you don't hear that much. Most of it is put forward in an intellectual context or an academic context, where people are considering these things rather than talking experientially. And when I left my activist period of time in Berkeley, I was so devastated by the co-option of everything that I figured I needed some spiritual space. So it was a very common trend to go from the ecstasy of the possibility of change and seeing it all around you. Like, I worked in a free university, I volunteered at a free health clinic, and then to sort of watch it all fall apart, and then to watch people move, it's almost like a death, and then move into a rebirth, which was an introduction to the world's spiritual traditions. And I was lucky enough to fall into the arms, well, not literally, but to be led to a man who was considered the Qutb of the planet at the time, a Sufi sheikh. And so that direct experience I had of just seeing him for the first time was a complete opening, blasting open of the heart and of space and of time. And I'm very, very grateful for that. And I guess I never thought about it, but I guess that was probably the beginning of the other experiences I've had in feeling like I lived in certain times, just feeling very comfortable about being in other times, and reading, The Descent of Inanna, for instance, in Sumer.
Oh,
And
incredible.
yeah, it just it's just so comfortable to just so hear someone describe that. And I think it was the opening image. It was an archaeological dig that you were talking about in Turkey.
The 18 floors of the underground city.
Yes, yes. And that, I think that's, you had the image of the underground caves in the dark mountains. So that image, I just looked at it and it brought back 3 dreams of mine that I hadn't thought about in a long time, where I had descended the stairs into the underworld. And one of them, I was alone. I came into very similar tunnels like that in a huge underground temple. There was a big rectangular table and there were people all sitting around it. And at one end, there was the king and queen, and I was brought forward and, okay, they said, so you've finally come, right? And another one was even closer to the images, almost exactly, where I was underground with my daughter, going through these different tunnels, beautiful tunnels, but clearly underground tunnels. And we'd come to sort of temple spaces, but there was no artifacts in them. It wasn't like, you know, you were excavating. And I shouldn't be talking about me, but anyway, it was it was an experience of looking for the lost feminine. That it turned out that was a lot of what that was about, and my mother and the great mother. So just the fact that you're talking about the masks we wear, the times that are infinite, it's, to me, you're starting to talk the language of quantum physics, if that makes sense, because we yeah, okay.
No,
So,
I think literally.
thank you. You know, it's a different experience than Andrea, but it's you know, it's coming from you know, from an appreciation of your work. So I hope you write more and speak more.
Well, the experiences I was talking about earlier, starting, you know, my mid-teens, led to a certain point. They led, you know, through kind of an avant-garde phase with meeting with other writers when I was younger, when I moved to Boston, period of tremendous cultural excitement in the city, which faded out in the early 80s. And that kind of reaching the limit of my own ability to rely on my own guidance, and also kind of a fading of the countercultural, or however you'd put that, scene in Boston. There was a period from the time I moved here in 74 up through about 82, where there was just an incredible ferment and a mixture of kind of a dialogue between the arts, with people, let's say, going to art school, who would start music groups, and there weren't really any exact boundaries between you know, painting, music, writing, and there was a Cambridge poets, forget what it was called, but poets would do collaborations with jazz musicians, and feeling of like actually being at home in the world for the first time, in a way that felt anti-gravitational to me and just released enormous amounts of energy. But that came to an end, both personally and to some extent politically, in the early Reagan years, and everything became much more expensive. A lot of the music clubs closed. The literary scene, I don't know, kind of lost its adventurous quality and became much more self-referential, and began to seem claustrophobic to me. Then I went through a period of studying with teachers, but in 1990, I had an experience like you were mentioning with your sheikh, of meeting Anandi Ma and receiving yogic initiation. Then shortly after that, encountering her teacher, Tian Yogi Madhusudandas, in dreams, in a way that actually has pretty much stayed with me, but it radically altered my sense of time, which was already very far from normal. But I had a sense early on, after the initiation, of being almost sucked out of time and space to some sort of a boundary, looking back at both the earth and myself from, I think what Sufis or Gnostics would describe as being the boundary between the 8th sphere and the 9th, where time becomes concave in a sense, where you're looking kind of down at it, almost like from the upper atmosphere of the earth down onto the surface. And that sort of became the starting point for a lot of my work that I began to try to do after that.
Go ahead, Eileen.
I'm wondering how you relate this to Jung, specifically to Jung.
In terms of his theories or his experience?
Both. It doesn't matter. I'm just wondering, you talked about Jung, you'd read Jung. You have some commonalities. I'm wondering what they are.
I would have to, give that more thought. I don't have an easy answer to that. I think probably the relationship between surface and depth. I tend to see things very much in terms of that opposition, that our own intelligence and our own kind of connection to our immediate culture, to me, is very much like objects in the foreground. Particularly these days with the almost pathological expansion and dominance of the media, our attention really has been kind of fractured and atomized so that we see immediately what's put before us. I think that's true in general of the way people tend to experience things in a normal state of awareness. We see time as being sequential. We're moving through space, kind of like we're, walking around the earth one mile after another, with things in front of us getting bigger, things behind us getting smaller. At the same time, though, the earth is a spherical volume that exists all at once in terms of being a container of all the oppositions that exist within it. So I think Jung had a similar sense of unity, perhaps, and a sense that surface intelligence was almost a kind of obstruction, and that our connection to our actual natures, our primordial natures or whatever, existed at a kind of depth, but the only way to find out what we know is to kind of plunge into what we don't know. So I think, Jung offered me an example as to how that might be done, and how, one really couldn't depend on anybody else in terms of taking that kind of a journey, and that, the risk was very much tied up with the possibility of transformation.
Can I add a kind of a footnote to that? Which is that Jung talks about psyche in a dual way. There is the personal psyche and our individuation process that our personal psyche goes through. But then there is the objective psyche. And in your work, it seems like the objective psyche, has erupted in your life, sometimes, very like spontaneously and frighteningly, and usually it's the other way around. Usually people, have to deal with their personal psyches and then they get to the depths. But it's like the depths came up and went whoop, and, enclosed you, and they jumped into your life, or the depths jumped into your life. And Sandra, you have your hand up too. I don't want to forget about that.
Oh, no, it just didn't go down the last time.
Oh, okay, I'll put it down.
I could say more.
Jeffrey, Jen, too. Do you want to?
I just wanted to point out there's a question in the chat from Eleanor. which I think is an interesting
Oh.
question, and I'd like to hear the answers. So,
Great, thank you.
Thanks, let me pull that up. Brian, is there anything you keep just for yourself, even if it's very big?
Well, it's, I'm not quite sure. Almost everything, really, until kind of recently. I mean, until I really began to try to publish, I kept, most things to myself. Partly just because, as I was saying, with that experience with, however you put it, cosmic sound or whatever, there didn't seem any way to really either communicate it or to trust anybody enough to really tell people, the more significant experiences. So one of the challenges has been just to find a language equal to my experiences or to the subtlety of my intuitions, and that's taken a very long time. So I do my best to tell people about things, whether they actually even something often gets lost in translation. So that's one reason I've been really hesitant to put out more than a certain amount until recently. But I've finished the 6 books that I was working on, so we're probably going to be putting out 1 per year, and then there'll be a lot of material available kind of all at once that's been accumulating over decades, particularly in that period after the yogic initiation. It was kind of a revisiting of certain things that had happened during teenage years in terms of reality just breaking open and primal energies beginning to flow very explosively. But because there were, I don't know, there was a sense that things were kind of being imposed upon me, or there was a certain violence to the primal energy when I first experienced it. So that made me want to back off, to kind of withdraw into my personal life, or to even kind of rest with my personal limitations rather than trying to push through to any kind of deeper integration. Then after the initiation, there was a sense of everything just being in motion, of almost everything I looked at becoming a kind of hieroglyphic sign. And then that would lead to a new level of reality beyond that, which would point to something else, so that everything became a web of correspondences. But things that I began then in the early 90s, I think there were 1, 2, 3 books that I began in those few years after the initiation that I've only finished over the past 2. So it's a very, very drawn out process, a labyrinthine one, as I said, which had less to do with wanting to keep anything secret and more to do with just my lack of ability to really communicate what I saw and knew. I'm quite happy to tell people almost anything, but people are not necessarily that open to hearing it.
I wanted to ask if you have doubts about yourself, about your vision, about your needs to communicate to others your personal vision, insofar as it's very personal. And there are many personal visions. Do you ever wonder that why you need to do this? And if you should do it?
Short answer is no. I have, doubts about my abilities, at times. Almost always, like with every piece I write, I reach a certain limit of knowledge, ability, talent, vision, whatever, which leads often to kind of a ritual of destruction. Almost none of my essays end up the way I intended them. So there's almost always a point where I just get fed up with what I'm doing and kind of begin to cut it apart. Then I'm left with certain pieces, certain unrealized potentials. And it's usually in that stage after the kind of destruction of what I'm trying to do that something else begins to emerge. And for me, that's the only work really worth keeping, is the work that emerges on the other side of that ritual of destruction. Which is not to say I can't write pieces quickly. Sometimes they come out that way, but those are pieces often that are, kind of waiting to be written, where things have been stored up over time. And, that kind of dialogue between creation and destruction has already gone on in relation to other pieces, or just on a spiritual level beforehand. And then, there's just an enormous pressure to get things out. So I've written pieces, as quickly as 2 or 3 days, and then other times 20 or 30 years.
John, are you nodding in some sort of feeling of?
I'm just nodding happily. But I have a question that I think could touch on various nodes. Brian, having watched the YouTube and then read some of your text today, that doesn't have to do with my question per se. More sort of the course of the conversation tonight, but including what I did earlier. This is really a sort of, I don't know, a question of practice maybe, or a praxis, I'm not sure if it is. Not necessarily theoretical, but theory is not a bad word. But I'm wondering about how you feel. Well, I was going to introduce a term though. In a Jung discussion, we might as well allow the term containment. So as we're talking about your work, and we're all here together, but then thinking of you containing these, whatever the language is, energies, forces, you used your own words to describe this, visions, containing this both personally and radically in your personal depths, but then also, as the term used earlier, at a broad level, and we can talk archetypally, we've got lots of different language we might want to deal with it at any given time. But the monster in the depths on one side, shall we say, that containment, containing the monster in the depths, if we just go with that image for a second, and then transforming into the visionary dimensions of at the broader level, and how containment works for you in your practice, which includes the writing, but would not be limited to the writing. It would be your total practice. There's a question in there somewhere. I'm not sure what it is.
Well, I had actually used the word container in an alchemical sense when I was talking with Billy Hepper, who is one of the hosts for the Occult Personality podcast, which should be coming up sometime over the next week. And I think that is kind of like one of the, so many things seem like accidents, misfortunes. We very seldom can go straight towards whatever we want, either in terms of career, romance, creative goals, spiritual goals, whatever. There's always an element of frustration, of blockage, so that even after what seems to be a dramatic spiritual breakthrough, let's say, so many people I've talked to, friends or whatever, have experienced some sort of like a weird contraction afterwards, like a bubbling up of negative energies or physical misfortune of some type. So I think there's a kind of push and pull involved in any kind of growth. And I think whether we choose to be contained or not, the overall pattern of our life story, our destiny or whatever, which I think is actually like a tangible thing. It's very much central to many traditions, which is the purpose of divination, to reunite you with whatever your pre-existent story is. But we're being contained by something beyond ourselves, whether we choose to embrace that containment or not. And I think one of the secrets of creativity is to actively embrace the containment, to turn every misfortune into an opportunity. And also, I think it's so easy to squander energy through any kind of anxiety, anticipation of the past, or anticipation of the future, regret for the past, whatever. So a lot of spiritual disciplines will talk about living in the present moment, which unfortunately often translates into something almost the opposite of spiritual vision. It's like you want to be happy, so just sort of block any other anxieties out. I'm sorry, I've been losing my train of thought. Containment. But I think, for me at least, the secret of creativity has to do with allowing energies to kind of bubble up within a certain confinement, embracing personal limitations, accidents, misfortunes, treating things as if they were actually a part of something that wants to happen, as opposed to something that you're fighting against. So I try not to waste anything. For example, on the recommendation of my editor, Marco Morelli had submitted the book to Kirkus for review, and the reviewer clearly had read like bits and pieces of the first 3 or 4 chapters and did not get anything about the book. But I took that as an opportunity to write an essay on how we really can't see, feel, know, or experience anything that exists too much outside of our immediate context. And I end the essay, which will go up pretty soon in Metapsychosis, with a whole series of horrific reviews of works that have come to be regarded as classics. Woodman's Leaves of Grass, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, whatever. People literally don't experience things when they first hear them the way that they might 150 years later, 100 years later, once they've received an official seal of approval. So anyway, that was just immediate an example of something that I could be easily annoyed about and was. But rather than treating it as being a misfortune, I treated it as a creative prompt. And that's what I've pretty much tried to do with my whole life story in terms of the book, to go back and see how things that just seem to happen, or things that seem to be really unfortunate detours, ended up becoming absolutely essential to my larger growth. So I'm partially choosing to not waste a scrap of experience, but also I'm acknowledging that a kind of container has been set up for me, which I can experience from the inside in a linear fashion, or from the outside in terms of however you define that larger aspect of the self.
Similarly, you talk about, but I haven't gotten to the point anyway where you might have described it in detail, of when you were teaching art, you had a process by which you would get your students to what did you say, a disorientation?
Yeah, it was a technique of creative disorientation.
Yeah, could you talk about that a little?
Sure. Yeah, I'd gone back to school in 2000 to get my teaching credentials. I had gone to art school in the late 70s. I come from a family of teachers and really felt that probably was my calling in some sense. And I had a couple of teachers, particularly one teacher who changed my life, and thought that I might be able to do the same thing for my students. I ended up teaching junior high for a while, and this was in the inner city. And I assumed that kids were going to love art, maybe like it more than, I don't know, mathematics or history or something. But by the time I got them, sixth grade to usually 8th grade, occasionally 9th, they had almost completely forgotten usually why they wanted to do art or that they'd ever had any kind of a playful relationship to it. I think most 4-year-olds have natural ability to speak in art. They see things visually, they love to draw, kind of move into an altered sense of time. But junior high students are incredibly self-conscious and group conscious and don't want to do anything that would make them seem like the teacher's pet or anything that would make them seem uncool in some way. So I had to really trick them into discovering what they could do and pulling hidden abilities out of them. So I would have to kind of back them into creative process. Telling people just to be creative or go crazy or whatever does absolutely no good. So I would have to set up a series of exercises. For example, one would be having 6 students sit around the table with a very interesting array of objects, maybe from different cultures, time periods, things that don't necessarily fit together in a normal still life, and have each student contribute to the drawing and then pass it on to the next one. Then that would become the basis for the next stage, which might be playing with scale, overlapping objects, thinking in terms of negative, positive space, bringing personal cultural history to the more formal exercises. So by the time they realized what they were doing, they were often like in the middle of a very active creative process, but in a way that kind of like what I was saying about my writing, would really take them by surprise. By the time they were doing it, it was too late to back out, and they were often very excited and delighted by what they were able to produce. Then there would be the issue of like, not seeming to listen to the teacher's advice for fear of becoming the teacher's pet. So I would have, it was always like a tug of war. I would have to offer advice without necessarily seeming to do it, but ended up getting results that took even me by surprise. Unfortunately, I didn't really receive any support from the administration of most schools where I taught, and had almost no creative energy of my own left over at the end of the day. So eventually decided that just wasn't something I could sustain over a longer period of time.
Indeed so.
John taught high school for 20 years.
Sandra also?
Sandra taught children, yeah. Sandra was a well, I'll let her speak for herself.
Well, yeah, there's something I was a Waldorf teacher, and so there's something very interesting that Steiner brought into that pedagogy, which was to create an education and to create people so that there was never a need for war again. So his first curriculum came in right after World War I. And he had the first, well, junior high is the toughest subject, the toughest kids to teach. I refused to go that way. I had 6th graders. I had 1st through 6th graders, and
up through 6, they have some fear of adults, not junior high kids.
Well, I mean, what I found was not fear, but joy.
Yeah.
And they still had access to their creativity, their flexibility, and their experience as young people, as you say, when they're in the world of fairy tale. So you can talk to trees and you can talk to owls, and the whole world is transparent and open to you in a way. And Steiner, believed that should be nurtured and prolonged as long as possible, the creative imagination of the child, right? And so we started with ancient history. You start with ancient history, and our first Yeah, I think we started with ancient, I can't remember now, it's so long ago, but ancient Egypt. And he said, when you're teaching, when you're telling, because it was storytelling, that we didn't have textbooks, you made your own textbooks, right? So immediately you were engaged with creative self-expression. And the teacher has to know the subject well enough to speak from her heart to the class. And so you're telling a story of, you know, Anubis or Isis and Osiris and how they went to other places and they, you know, they sang and they drummed and they used poetry to try to put an end to war. And he said, in those years, children still have access to their past lives. And when you're telling ancient history, mythology, really, when you're teaching, because history comes much later, you know, when you're teaching mythology, you can see when a child resonates with that era, you know, from thousands and thousands of years ago. They've just completely transformed right in front of your eyes. And I saw that happen again and again and again. And so, you know, I took his words on many subjects, pretty much straight to heart. And he was, you know, he taught according to the developmental stages of the human being. That was what he was interested in doing, was in taking the right moment for the child's development and filling it sort of with where we had been at that moment as a collective human evolutionary species, right? So yeah, it was just a fantastic experience. I didn't burn out. I just had a further calling. But I think you would make a great Waldorf teacher.
I just didn't find the right situation, and I never had a car, so I couldn't really travel anywhere.
Even better if you have to walk to school as teacher or as student.
But yeah, I got into serious trouble in one of my courses where we were studying Piaget, but I kind of paraphrased all of the things that I was supposed to have picked up from Piaget, but I personally feel that those stages are a kind of recapitulation. They're not a discovery for the first time.
Yeah.
The whole idea of education is, in terms of the Greek word, is like a calling forth of something that already exists. And I wrote, I thought, a pretty formidable essay from that position, but it just didn't fit in with the, you know, more normal scientific orientation of the teacher. And she marked me down to a B, and I appealed to the head of the department and got the grade changed back to an A.
Oh, good.
Well, we are just about at time here.
Can I read one piece to close?
Yes, please.
Many more I'd wanted to read, but that maybe I can send them or something to people.
That would be great. We've been too chatty.
Sure.
Oh, but read some of them.
I dropped some things, so I have to find where they went.
Please do send them. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, send them to Lisa, or yeah, and she can send them out.
So
Right, Lisa?
John will send them out.
Thank you, John.
We'll get them out.
We'll get them out. So while he's looking, I'll just put up his book again, which just came out. This is it's just one of those books that you have to live with. You know, you read it once and you realize you've only like explored 20% of the fractals, and then you read it again and it's like, oh my God, there's more there. And then, you know, it's one
Right,
of those
and
kind of books.
you haven't talked about your artwork really at all, which is quite extraordinary as well as your writing.
Probably, you know, maybe we can do this again sometime. Really no time to get into the art. But yeah, we had talked about deep time, so this is a relatively short passage on that. This is just an excerpt from a piece that I submitted to Dark Mountain this week. which contains some excerpts from older pieces and some newer material that I just wrote this week. So I'm just going to read a short excerpt from At First There Were Eight. Almost all that we were has vanished. There are laws, it seems, that block our access to deep time. The homes that we once occupied weigh nothing, yet some few cents are left. Catastrophes call from the ground beneath our feet. The gods are hungry. The dead do not sleep well, and they are not pleased that we shrug at the greatest of their gifts. We have lost touch with the role the cosmos once informed us we should play. To step into this role that so easily eludes us, which seems as out of date perhaps as the Ptolemaic model of the solar system. We must take back the power that we once casually threw away. We must find the weapons that are hiding in the alphabet. We must reimagine what it means to speak. To speak, as I employ the term, is not simply to describe or to narrate or to analyze or to argue. No. To speak is to perform an oceanic rite, to engage in a contest with that which can destroy one, to call something from the depths, from the mists of what at first appeared to be nothing. To speak is to steal fire from a mushroom, to stand the sky on an atom. To speak is to assert one's vision against one's supposed superiors, to breathe life into the noseless statues of the ancients, to reconfigure the features that one had earlier smashed. To speak is to plant a seed that will open into silence. To speak is to make haste slowly, to make love to the cosmos by stealth. To speak well is to dare. It is to pull the rug of nature from beneath the feet of Mercurius, to then catch him as he falls. By such methods, it may be possible to seal a pact with the unknown.
Wow. Yes.
Oh,
Oh,
Stunningly beautiful, profound, deep.
So I'll send a few pieces around to people if Lisa can tell me how to do that.
just send them to me and I will make sure they're distributed to our email list.
Will do. And I should have a piece up on metapsychosis in a day or two. Monsieur Flaubert is not a writer, is the name of it after an early review of Madame Bovary.
So metapsychosis is the online journal that this cooperative publisher that both, well, Brian and Jeffrey Jen and Andrea and I are all part of this cooperative publishing enterprise.